I was right. I predicted the NDP would win the provincial election here in BC. Fine. I said it would be a minority government, but I was not that far off, guys. I was not that far off. That Surrey Guildford riding has been kind of a nail biter. I may yet get my prediction. Just hold on to your horses. I may yet get my prediction of a minority NDP government. As it stands, the BC NDP is leading or elected in 47 seats of the 93 available, while the Conservatives have won 45 seats. The BC Greens have also claimed a very respectable 2 seats. Now, we know the NDP will form government, and we know that John Rostad is not having it.
If we're in that situation of the NDP forming a minority government, we will look at every single opportunity from day one to bring them down at the very first opportunity and get back to the polls.
Anyways, before we shut shop for this election cycle, here are 5 things we learned watching John Rostad blow the 2024 BC provincial elections. Respectfully. Number 1, rural BC is pissed. One of the big features in this year's election was the urban-rural divide. Most of urban BC went NDP and most of rural BC went Conservative. Check this out. The blue, of course, in this chat represents the BC Conservatives. The orange is the BC NDP. And the little green cluster right there is the BC Greens. Now that looks like a lot of blue, right? But really it isn't. You've got to realize that only 12% of the population of BC lives in the rural areas, and this was where the bulk of the support for the Conservative was clustered. Unfortunately for them, most of the BC population lives in the big cities. So places like Vancouver, like Victoria, like Burnaby, while small in land area, those end up having a lot more seats. And these more urban areas went overwhelmingly NDP. The challenge for the NDP now as they form government is to bridge that rural-urban divide again. The people in those rural areas have legitimate concerns. The forestry sector and the rising healthcare costs are 2 of the issues rural British Columbians were voting on in this election cycle. The forestry industry is a major employer in rural BC and has faced a lot of headwinds lately. So these things obviously impact the local economy and the families dependent on those jobs. So think about that. Rural areas also struggle with healthcare costs. Yes, we've got publicly funded healthcare, but if you have to drive to another town to get said healthcare, it adds up. In 2022, for example, emergency rooms in places like Clearwater or Chetwynd or Mackenzie or Port McNeill were closed for an equivalent of like 4 months due to staffing shortages or illness. In 2024, the BC Interior already had about 62 temporary closures before August. So if I lived in these rural areas, I would be worried as well. Some voters obviously felt in this election that the BC NDP had not done enough to improve healthcare and services. Obviously, there are bigger macroeconomic problems facing British Columbians in general. I'm talking about affordable housing, rising cost of living. These things impact those in the rural areas as well. Now, this is not to say that the BC NDP has not done anything. Clearly, though, it hasn't really scratched the surface. But they've been looking at ways to diversify the economies of rural BC through the Rural Economic Diversification and Infrastructure Program. They have also announced $75 million for rural health loan forgiveness programs. This initiative is supposed to attract healthcare professionals to rural areas by offering student loan forgiveness of $10,000 to $20,000 for doctors, nurses, and other healthcare practitioners who commit to staying in rural communities for at least 5 years. But there's clearly room for improvement, and the BC NDP should take this message and work to provide equity for people in small town BC. Now let's move on to number 2. The second lesson we learned through this election cycle: John Rostad blew it big. He blew it. When I did my final predictions, I expressed to you guys that I felt that the election was there to be won for John Rostad. People are craving change. We are in the middle of an affordability crisis, a housing crisis, an opioid crisis. There is an appetite for something different. To some extent, people were okay with his quirkiness for the most part. Like, sure, he had zero climate policy and didn't like vaccine mandates. But these are all things I feel like people were willing to overlook. I think it was especially diabolical that they decided to release their costed platform just 4 days before the election. Like, What are you doing? I mean, it was like he was begging to lose the election. Like, to make things worse, that platform was basically predicting some phantom GDP growth that gave people cause to call bullshit. Like, how do you wait that long and still do a shit job? That's what I want to know. So that was strike one. And I feel, okay, maybe he would have been fine. But the second part of the equation, the second part of the great BC conservative implosion, was the controversy surrounding some of the MLAs. Now, the BC election is not a popularity contest. If it was, maybe John Rosted would have squeaked through despite some questionable decisions. It is basically 93 different elections. He put together a ragtag group of just weird MLAs, people with a history of racist remarks or just weird conspiracy theories. It is interesting, though, that some of those questionable characters actually got elected. People like Brent Chapman in Surrey South, people like Herman Bangu in Langley Abbotsford. You know what? With the success of these candidates, despite the controversy around them, maybe John Rosted was the problem. Like, maybe wild conspiracy theories are the best base for the modern politician. My point here is that David Eby was there to be beaten. He oversaw an absolute catastrophe in the decriminalization of hard drugs. He reversed the decision in the lead up to the election. While the opioid crisis is really complex, I do not think that outright decriminalization or having the government take on the business of selling hard drugs is the answer. On this, you could argue Sonia Forcino probably had the best ideas. On the carbon tax, David Eby basically passed the buck by stating correctly that he would axe the carbon tax if the federal government removed the requirement to collect it. Again, there was room to challenge him there. There was room to challenge him on things like affordability and home prices as well. Again, let me just tell you, it felt to me like John Rostad really wanted to lose this election. So first he bombed heavy at the leaders' debate, and then he dropped a shit platform just days to the election. That's probably why he lost. All told, I think BC chose the right guy in David Eby. People forget that he has only been premier for 2 years, and truthfully, there are signs there that he could really improve things going forward. Now let's move on to number 3. At number 3, I think the Green Party will be key. Now, Sonia Forcino, the BC Greens leader, did not win her riding, so she's not going to be part of the legislature. She made the decision to move to Victoria Beacon Hill after representing Cowichan Valley for 7 years. Ultimately, she couldn't breach the NDP stronghold. No shame in that. Her party could hold the balance of power in this next term, though. Her party won 2 seats in West Vancouver Sea to Sky and Saanich North and the Islands. Here's why that matters, even with the NDP majority government. Presumably, the Speaker of the newly constituted House will come from the NDP. Now, you'll recall that the Speaker only gets to vote as a tiebreaker. So that means the NDP will be just short of the 47 votes required to pass legislation. And you know John Rostad is looking to make things difficult so he can force an election. He has told us that much. So that makes things very interesting because the NDP will need some support from the BC Greens. The NDP, of course, have collaborated with the BC Greens before, and it still appears they have common values. I wonder, though, what the Greens will ask for in return. In 2016, they got the Clean BC plan and the referendum on proportional representation. Ultimately, that referendum failed. But I'd be curious to see their terms this time. Now let's move on to number 4. At number 4, the NDP must get to work. Quickly, guys. Take a screenshot before it is deleted. Take a screenshot of those promises they made. I'm joking, okay? Yeah, I think it will be interesting, though, to see what items on their platform actually get achieved. I personally am interested in the income tax cut. They said it would be like $1,000 for each household. Let's get that done, please. So they also promised a bunch of cost-saving measures for families. Presumably, if those come soon, we can start to see some relief from the affordability crisis, right? So I'll keep this one short. If there was anything to be learned from this election for the BC NDP, if they are to be a government for all of British Columbia, they must address the concerns of rural BC. The policies cannot just flow south of the Fraser River anymore, you know? I think you guys will like number 5, so let's move on to that one. At number 5, Pierre Poilievre can still implode. Just like John Rostad, there are a few lessons from these BC elections that we can kind of extrapolate to the federal election. I know. Provincial politics is very different. It's not the same as the federal politics. But in a moment, you'll see what I mean. If I was a betting man, I would take those odds of Pierre Poilievre winning the next election any day of the week. But here's the thing. This is not a popular vote. The reality is that there will be 343 elections to determine who becomes the next prime minister. So Pierre Poilievre's fate is not in his own hands. For sure, you can expect the Liberals to go to work on him as well. And you've seen that with the controversy around the security clearance in the inquiry into foreign interference. The big thing is his party will be running a bunch of MPs who may have serious character flaws, just the same way John Rostad found out, right? I say that, but a lot of those people still won. Now, I don't know, maybe being racist or conspiracy theorist is the best base for politics. Like, just look at the US, guys. Like, maybe it is. Maybe that's the new way. But to be fair, I expect a more sensible debate here in Canada once the election rolls around. We cannot get complacent because I'll tell you, the level of stupid on the internet right now is just different. And the bots do a good job, just like they'll just whip up a storm. On foreign interference, I don't think any country looking to interfere in our elections even needs to bother turning MPs anymore. Like, just farm a whole bunch of troll comments online. It's ridiculously easy. But to bring it back to my point though, the federal election is not a foregone conclusion. There is still an opportunity for Pierre Poilievre to implode big time. And he has taken some risks lately. The Conservatives voted to support the expansion of old age security. Now that worked out for them in the end because the Liberals did not pony up. And so now the Bloc Québécois no longer supports them. That worked out, but it could have gone south real quick. This whole business of not getting a security clearance as well is very risky. Now, assuming there are some conservative MPs who colluded with China, what stops the Liberals from releasing those names publicly near the election? Just think about that. So there are landmines everywhere, and I think people are underestimating Justin Trudeau just a tad, just a little bit. Y'all know how much I enjoy these games. I will be watching. Anyways, there you go. Those are 5 lessons we learned from the BC elections. In the end, I think BC made the right choice for now. It is time to hold DBDB and his NDP accountable. There are real issues facing British Columbians, from housing to healthcare to cost of living. And the NDP has made a lot of promises on the road to election night. I would like to see them knuckle down and deliver for British Columbians. I'll see you next time.